The 58th gate, the joyous. What a wonderful piece of business this is. Oh, it's an extraordinary gate. After all, we know that the logic process is starved for energy. That logic is the only gates of the throat that have no direct access to a motor. So that the 58th gate and the 52nd gate in the root center, and they are opposite each other. This is the right angle cross of service. The 58, the 52, the 18, and the 17. A purely logical cross. It is here for the service of the totality, the service of the collective. And in this cross are the two pressure gates of the whole logic system. And it's so important to understand that that means that the energy that is there for the logic process must be of service to the collective. Remember, being of service to the collective does not mean that you're of service to the individual or the tribe. It means you're of service to the collective, which is impersonal. You know, the collective may decide that it's good to have all retarded children neutered. As a collective stance, one can argue about that and take a vote in a committee and decide that it's for the well-being of the collective genetic pool. None of that is taken personally. It's collective. Now, of course, if you happen to be that retarded child, or you happen to be the family of that retarded child, you're going to have a totally different perspective on that. Being of service to the collective does not mean necessarily that that's going to be appreciated by the individual or the tribe. Be clear about that. The 58th gate. Stimulation is the key to joy. You know, every time that the 58 can fuel an experiment, a challenge to authority that leads to an experiment, it's full of joy. It says, use me, use me, use me. And I say that without that being negative. The first line, perhaps the most beautiful of all the lines in terms of its flowery language. I must have been in a strange mood that day. Love of life. The practical sense that even short-term activity should be of value. And what that means is what interests you, go through to the end of that. It is one of the ironies of design that the most existential of all circuitry is the abstract. And yet they don't know it. Because the greatest potential of the abstract is to surrender to their activity in the now, and when it's done, to get the reward through reflection. So when you're dealing with quality, what it's really saying is, when you're attracted to an idea, follow it through to the end before you allow another idea to pull you away. And if you allow that to take place, if you follow that idea through to the end, it will be of value to you later. And of course, being the first line, being the line of introspection, of looking inward, of trying to find the foundation, this is about what stimulates. The moon in detriment, the moon has its phases, its moods that will limit joy to an intermittent and cyclical experience. Well, all right. But you know, it's still love of life. It just means that these, have you ever seen 58 ones? Any 58 ones here? No? No, it's too bad. Because all you have to do is ask them to smile. A 58 one smiles like nobody else. They do. They really do. They have an unusual smile. It's like 37s. You know, the 37 smile is distinctive. It is the gate of the mouth. The 58 ones, they have this smile that's almost a smirk. You know? It's this kind of thing that says, I got the juice to knock you off the table, you know. The second line. Oh, I adore this line for what it has done to analyst psyches for years. Perversion. And they get really upset, eh? Do I have to say this? Okay, so let's understand it. We know already that the second line is the hermit. That's its behavioral pattern. So we know that if you have a 58th gate, and the 58th gate is absolutely essential to the logic process, and everybody in the logic process wants to have access to that you got a 58-2, and they've locked themselves in their room, and they're about their own business, and they're not helping the collective one bit. And because of that, they get people who burst in on them, knock on their door, knock on their window, to try to yank them out of that and say, hey, look, man, you got all this juice, Why don't you give it to me for this? Because they do not have any control over where their energy goes. Their energy ends up going into very strange things that the rest of the collective resents. So instead of them dedicating their energy so that, I don't know, whatever, a new park can be built so the kids can have fun, they're dedicating their energy to collecting information on pornographic films on animals. And everybody says they're really perverse. Well, it's the people that called them out that are the strange ones. In other words, their idea of what needs to be collectively experimented with and checked isn't what the majority of the collective would consider essential use of that energy. And usually it's just jealousy and bitching. I wish I had gotten to that 58-2 first. I could have fooled that little bugger into giving me all their energy for my weird thing. It's because they don't know. They can't quantify that. It's lower trigram. They don't have those skills. They don't know the 18 at the other end. They don't know that their energy is there to challenge authority. That's why the 58-1 is blissed out. It doesn't really know how hard it is to use that energy to change the collective. It doesn't. It's just there in its buzz going, I got all this juice, it's great. I'm ready to challenge anything. I don't know what anything is. So the 58-2 gets called out and its energy gets used for unusual things. Now, by the way, for example, a 58-2 that worked in human design could be called perverse by other people who don't like this kind of stuff. You understand? It's not perverse in and of itself. It is the way in which it is viewed. There is no exaltation. That's to, get you caught up even more in this line. A genius for perversity. Yes, a genius for perverse stimulation that afflicts oneself and others by promoting degeneracy and reducing joy to indulgence and decadence. I love it. I love it. Well, it's true. This is not about morality. I mean, remember something. The 384 lines are covering the code of the genetic totality. So it's in the language of the genetic totality. The rest of the collective that needs that energy to build that park, to them, anything that 58-2 is going to do, anything, they're going to put every bad name and label on it that they possibly can. Now remember something. My way of describing this so that you can see that comfortably is that you can't live that out comfortably unless you're living out your own nature. In the collective, there are many things in the collective that the majority of the collective are interested in that bypass essential things for the minority in the collective. It does not mean that those things should be totally overlooked. They have as much a right to legitimate investigation as anything else. That's what the 58-2 is good for. That is, they can be brought into things that belong to minority interests in the collective to provide their energy. The fact that the majority doesn't like that, that's another story. If they're entering in as themselves, where they put their energy will be conditioned by their recognition and learning about the other. If they enter in as themselves, their minority challenge can be of value and not be something that really degenerates. You know, you can challenge the authority by smuggling cocaine. You know, it can be in any shape or form. Whatever you do in this life, if you're a 58-2, is going to be conditioned by who knocks on your window. So you better know how to enter in properly as yourself. Third line, electricity. These are the great teases. You know, third lines drive people crazy. You know, you're a boss and you hire yourself a third line. And they look so good. Oh, they look so good. And they're great for like a week, a month, maybe a year. And you've got all these expectations about them. And then they leave. So think about that in the context of providing energy for challenge. Yeah? Electricity. The individual whose electric vitality creates its own stimulation and is not dependent on others. The energy to fuel independent stimulation. Now, they're classic lower trigram. They're in on their own process. They got their own energy. They don't know there's the other. But of course, it's third line. They're going to bang into them. When they bang into the other says, oh, you have collective energy. You have logical collective energy. That's for me. And the third line saying, no, 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 no. It's mine. It's not yours. And when I've had enough of you, because I don't know who the hell you are, I'm going to go back and stimulate myself. So they're sought after. They keep on banging in with their energy, and other people would like to tap into it. If you have a defined motor in your design, a defined motor is a purse or a wallet. Just think about it that way. It helps. You know, it's energy, and the wallet is full of stuff. So the moment that anybody who doesn't have one of those defined wallets meets you and steps into your aura, they go into your wallet instantly. I mean, instantly. I keep on telling motor people how important it is for them to recognize that other people want their energy. I mean, it's not like they go around saying, hey, look, this one's got 3 motors on. You know, they're just naturally attracted to it. So, of course, this 58-3, this wonderful energy for the whole logic process is deeply attractive to the collective. So they bang in and the collective tries to grasp that and hold on to it, and of course they won't. You know, they're designed to break the bonds. They're designed to build an experiential process. Remember, they have to go as a behavioral theme from the martyr to the role model. That's their process. Mars and detriment. The quality of fire is dependent on its fuel and subject to its influence, good or bad. The energy for aliveness that is dependent on others for stimulation. You just bang in. You always want to be what you're not. I mean, the 58 always wants to be the 18, but the 58 lower trigram doesn't know there is an 18. So every time that they meet that force on the other side, they get very excited. It seems that there is an outlet, a true outlet for their pressure. Now, the 58th gate is a gate of stress. When you meet the 58th gate, it immediately stresses you out. You know, that's what it's there to do. It puts you under stress. By the way, it does that so it makes it easier to challenge the authority. You know, if the authority is stressed out, it's easier to challenge it. There's an adrenal field. When you get to the upper trigram, because we are dealing with a collective circuit, which is by its very nature the most social of all circuitry, and you get to the upper trigram, so you get to this transpersonal karma, this transpersonal capacity, the recognition that there's the gate at the other end. How different the 58 is when it knows that it has to select the right 18 in order to successfully move its energy, find its joy in its challenge. By the way, when I talk to you of challenge, challenge isn't necessarily there for the overthrow of the pattern that the authority represents. Please understand that. It's inherent in logical processes that no pattern, that no authority can be allowed an absolute reality. That they all must be subject to the examination and assessment of the collective on a continuing basis. Our whole collective system is based on that. The constant challenge to pattern. In most cases, when you're challenging a pattern, you're really hoping that you'll fail. In other words, to discover that there's actually something wrong with the pattern means that the whole collective has to be changed. And that's quite something. You know, it's interesting. I follow a lot of science, and somebody will come up, some university, some whatever, they'll come up with some kind of statement about something or whatever it may be. And then you have whole teams of people around the world that instantly challenge it. They instantly ask for all the experimental data. They instantly redo all of the experiments. They instantly check it out. 9 times out of 10, they find that it doesn't work. I mean, it's amazing to follow that process. Instantaneously, there is the energy for challenge. I mean, that is our collective process. It's absolutely essential for us. So don't get into thinking that this challenging thing is simply about overthrowing the authority. It isn't, and it often looks that way. You know, that's the superficiality of it that we call Oedipus Electra in the 18th gate. It's a superficial. You know, instead of the pattern, you challenge, instead of the pattern of parenthood, which may or may not be correct, you challenge the parents themselves. The real challenge is to the pattern of parenthood. And of course, what you're trying to do is to establish whether that pattern is valid through your challenge or whether it should be overthrown and a new kind of system developed. We've already had that. We've had vast experimentation in the last 50 years with parenthood. So focusing. The upper trigram. Pluto exalted. Again, there is going to be, if you're looking at all of the gates through Sagittarius and here into Capricorn, Pluto over the next 25, 30 years is going to be moving through this whole area. So, of course, you're going to have generations that are going to come into the world carrying this information. It's one of the joys for me of the daily ephemeris. The daily ephemeris is 3 things for me. I look at it in terms of what it could possibly be for me. I look at it to see what everybody else is going to experience that day, and I look at it to see who's being born into the world. So one of the things to recognize is that, of course, here, like in the 4th line with Pluto exalted, there's going to come a point, where we're going to have a whole generation, tens of millions of people coming into the world. If you want to understand the future, just look how the program gets activated, and you'll begin to glimpse the energy fields that are coming into the world. This is my work in Global Incarnation Index. To see this movement of information, this movement of genetic material moving in at different times, coming in different cycles. Pluto hasn't been in the 58th gate for over 250 years or 240 years. It's a very, very long time. That means that we in the world have not had that generation with that specific imprinting for a long time. Them coming in is going to change the genetic material of the whole. In other words, we're going to have a new kind of influence coming in. It's fascinating to watch this with the outer planets and to see the generations that are coming into the world now. A natural specialization, when confronted with a multiplicity of stimulations, will have no inner difficulty in focusing on the appropriate influence, obviously. This is a line of being fixed. This is a line of externalization. The energy to fuel recognition of which stimulation is of value. In other words, they have no difficulty finding the 18 at the other end. That doesn't mean, by the way, that the challenge is successful. It simply means that they find the 18 that they can externalize this pressure to challenge. Remember, the upper trigram here is putting out into the world stress and pressure. The lower trigram is holding the stress and pressure within themselves. Think about that. Very different. So you're going to find that the 4th, 5th, and 6th lines are going to be much more stressful in the way you experience them, because they're going to deliver it. They're going to put you under pressure to do the challenging. You know, you've been talking about shooting that person. Here's the bullets. It's America. You like my American analogies? Neptune in detriment. Very interesting, this Pluto-Neptune business here. And of course, this Neptune generation is in the world now. And these are children that are now 8 and 9 years old, 10 years old. An impressionability that becomes confused when confronted with a multiplicity of stimulations, and in trying to accommodate all of it becomes unstable. Now we've got a whole generation of kids that are overstimulated, and they don't know which stimulation to go for. You know, you've got your television and your Nintendo, and you got this and you got that and you got whatever the other thing is, and all the things that are around there. You've got a whole generation of kids that are unstable because they have no way of seeing where to really put their energy into what thing that's stimulating out there. Energy which becomes unstable when overstimulated. So they need to be focused, which of course is the opposition to the 58. In the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of this 4th line, we have the cross shift. The 17 and the 18 are replaced by the 21 and the 48. And this is called the juxtaposition cross of vitality. These are very, very stimulating forces. So many of the health aspects in the collective process are rooted here in the 58th gate, this gate of vitality, of life vitality. And of course, life is threatened when the pattern is wrong. At least that's the collective way of perceiving it. The left angle cross is the cross of demands. The 58, the 52, the 48, and the 21. This is the cross of demands. The 5th line is called defense. The natural and practical, again, you can see in the continuity, practical is simply a word that always pops out when the 5th line is around. Practical solutions. The natural and practical instinct to protect oneself regardless of temptations. Regardless of temptations. Remember that the general is always being tempted to use its power, because the projected field can always call it. But it can never submit to using its power. No, I'm not running for election. No, I'm not running for election. No, I've not made a decision about whether or not I will run for the presidency. No, I'm not running for election. The general stands out there and keeps on saying, no, no, no. But every time they say no, everybody's listening. to pull the projected field. Why do they keep saying no when we need them? But of course, the general knows it's not time yet. And it's to wait for that moment of crisis, that moment when a practical solution. So they wait, for example, for the right issue suddenly to jump up, and then all of a sudden they're saying, I didn't want to run, but now because of the way in which they're doing this, that, and that, I know that I can do a better job, and here's my practical blah, blah, blah. The detriment. But the sun is also exalted here. The assumption that the best defense is a good offense that might allow strength of character to enjoy questionable stimulus without succumbing to it. The energy for aliveness, which forsakes self-defense and will embrace questionable stimulations. Now that's being pulled out at the wrong time because of who pulls you out. Everything about the collective process, here we're just looking at a gate. After all, it knows that there's a gate at the other end, but still it has to wait for the gate at the other end. And it can end up in a situation where the attractiveness of the being at the other end, of the personality at the other end, distracts it from its natural strategy. Think about that. When the heretic challenges tradition, the heretic can get away with it. But when the heretic makes it personal and challenges behavior, they're automatically going to have to deal with powerful resistance. It is what you're seeing here in the detriment. That is, you make it personal. It's not about the collective need for the challenge. It's not about seeing what challenge and what authority that energy should be put to. It's about that person is interesting to me. And the moment that that gift gets personal, that's the moment that it can result in conflict. The sixth line, carried away. It starts off its life with all that electricity, stimulating itself, not thinking that it needs the other, only to find out how frustrating that is. And it gets to the sixth line, and it gets totally carried away with that collective process, until it can rise above it. The tendency to practicality that while thoroughly enjoying external stimulation has the instinct to draw back when its independent integrity is threatened. The energy to fuel independent integrity that will maintain its identity in times of stimulation. Now look, no sixth line can avoid its third line phase. It has to go through that in order to have enough experience to grow into its wisdom. The difference is when that ends. I've mentioned to you that somewhere around the end of the teenage years, and rarely into the early 20s, that's about how long that third line stage is for most sixes. That isn't to say that there aren't exceptions. There will be. But most of those exceptions simply have to do with people not being themselves, so they don't work according to Hoyle. So this electrical part is going to come very young. Most sixth lines learn their lessons by the time they're 10 years old. Because you get it in your family real fast when you're a sixth line. You have to go through your third line martyr trip, and the first people that you meet in your life are your family, so you do your martyr trip in the family until you can rise above that. Some kids never get out of that. It's a deep conditioning. But then you can end up being able to secure your identity, which is what the third line had in the first place. and really get to a position above that where you can really see clearly where to put this energy so that it really is productive for the collective. There are so many needs for experimentation, yet so few things that truly need to be experimented with. And only those things that can be identified by the 16, that the 16 can really see, yes, this will be something that can be experimented. Only then is that possible. So there is quite a process. Remember that the 6th line doesn't just see the gate at the other end of the channel. It sees the whole circuit. That 6th line here recognizes that just giving energy to a challenge is not what it's all about. That's just self-serving. To give energy to a challenge that can manifest as experiment, that can become part of the collective process, that can ultimately lead humanity into a more secure pattern, or confirm to humanity that they are in a secure pattern. That's the ultimate concern of this 6th line. Mercury in detriment. When its basic intelligence is effectively stimulated, its natural desire for attunement will lead it to identify so strongly with the stimulation that it's at risk of losing its identity. The energy which fuels the loss of identity in times of stimulation. When you get to the point that you've looked around in your life and seen that you can put your energy into all kinds of stuff, but it doesn't lead to where you think it should, and that you finally get something that really looks like that, you will lose your identity in it. Okay, this is, after all, collective. It will be damaging to you only if you enter into that situation not as yourself. Remember, if you enter into something according to your definition and type and authority, then the aspects of your design are always going to operate properly and are always going to meet what's correct for them. If you have a line that says you have to break your leg, there's no such line, and that happens to be your line, break your leg properly. You know? Enter into your relationship properly, and if you enter into it properly as yourself, that moment of breaking your leg will be a very, very important moment in your life, because it will lead you correctly into the next stage of your life. But if you don't live out your own nature, you keep breaking your leg. And each time you break your leg, nothing comes of it. And you keep on breaking your leg and nothing comes of it. You just keep on breaking your leg, and after a while it hurts. You know? It's very important to see that if you enter in properly, you get the benefit for every aspect that's there in your nature. You just do, even if it appears to you that that's terrible. Because you don't know until you experience it correctly. You just don't know. At this point, where you can look and you can see clearly what can possibly be a valued challenge, what deserves that stimulation. The next step is the recognition that it's going to be a fight. It's going to be a struggle to get that out into the world. And it's true. We go to the 38th gate.